Well, what do you say we get back to our draw knife project? It's been filed, hardened, tempered, and we noticed that it has a bow, so we need to straighten it. Now, this bow probably would not hurt this draw knife any. After posting the first video, or I should say the second video, where we acknowledged the fact we've got a problem, there were a few people that commented that they had draw knives with bows like this, older ones, and they actually found them easier to use. So there might be some reason to leave it, but since I didn't set out to do it, I'm going to see if I can correct it. Now, I retempered this to try to get the temper more even and make sure that we didn't have any odd irregularities in the tempering. And as a result, hopefully it will straighten. Now, we are working with a combination of mild steel, which will straighten just fine, and tool steel, which isn't going to want to straighten so much because it's relatively hard. The softer the tool steel is, the more likely you're going to be to bend it. There's a risk that we're going to crack it at this point. So one option would be to put it back in the fire, normalize it, straighten it, normalize it again, and maybe normalize it again after that, just to be absolutely sure it's as stress-free as possible, and try hardening it again. I'm going to go ahead and try the approach of straightening it in its current condition. We're going to go back to the vise with our 3 straightening pins and take a very controlled approach to this, and hopefully it will all work out. So if you look down this, you should be able to see that gap. It's about an 1/8 inch gap, and it's a little bit sharper bend on this end than it is on that end. So we're going to just work this slowly, and we have to over bend this because it will want to bounce back. Remember, you use steels like this as springs, and springs want to return to where they were originally. And that's one reason we may have to get this hot to do it, but it would be at a tempering temperature hot, not a forging temperature hot. And I've done this before with some success, but sometimes it is hours long of gentle bending, putting it back in to retemper, and bring it back up to the tempering temperature and try to keep it hot throughout the entire process. But we are making some progress here. I'm going to move these pins in. It's a fairly sharp kink. And listen for the little tink that tells you you broke it. So at that point you're just done, and you're going to have to start all over. I think we're pretty good there. There's just one little wobble, and the back of the cutting edge is actually straighter than the very back, so I think we're going to call that good. So now let's go back to our board and the vise to clean up the cutting edge a little bit. Now the back of the blade needs to be pretty well cleaned up and nearly polished. And that's where we're going to start, because this has to be smooth to be able to get a sharp edge on the edge has to be good smooth material front and back. So since this is flat, it's got to be polished pretty much the whole way. Now this is about 50% hard steel. The hard steel runs right through here and is exposed that whole way. So you're not going to do a lot of filing, but you can do a little bit. We can do some draw filing. This time I'm using a very fine file. The fact that that's not cutting very, you can hear that one escape. So we got a good hard edge here. So that's just not doing much of anything. I'm just going to wrap a piece of abrasive paper around a piece of bar stock here, and we're going to use it just like draw filing. You're going to hand sand this is what you're going to have to put up with. So hopefully you got a nice smooth finish before you harden it. Sandpaper won't last long doing it this way. You're going to have to keep moving it. If you have wet or dry sandpaper, you can use a little oil or water or something else on it to help make this easier. There's no doubt the belt sander or belt grinder will be the fastest way to do this, but it's also possible to heat it up and over temper the edge. So you're looking at several hours of doing this. Right now I'm using 150 grit paper. And we need to do this until we get rid of any scratch pattern left from the original draw filing. And no, I'm not going to make you watch me do this for hours. I'm going to go use the belt sander. If you are going to do this by hand and want to start with a file, this is an older file, it's fairly well worn, which is one of the reasons it didn't cut well. Get a brand new file and start with a new smooth cut file, or at least a second cut file, and that will do better than this old worn out file. But then it is sandpaper for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it takes. Now I know not everybody has the luxury of a belt sander, but if you do, this is a good place to make use of it. You want to be careful and just keep the blade edge and make sure it all contacts the platen. You can work it this way, but be real careful about not digging in that edge. You've got to be in complete control. So I'm going to start this way, but I can't bring my tangs up because they'll hit, because I've dropped them just a little bit to make the knife more comfortable to work with. So you have to pay attention to all that stuff when you're doing this. And I've got it turned down to the slowest speed so it won't get too hot. I work barehanded so I can feel the heat if it starts to build up. This will be uncomfortable to hold long before I have altered the temper in the blade. Well, here we have a draw knife that has been ground and is ready for handles. I've taken this to a 400 grit finish both on the bevel and on the back. Ultimately it will need to be higher than that, but I don't want to go to the point that it's getting sharp yet, because it's dangerous while you're putting handles on. You're liable to nick the edge and you're liable to cut yourself, so it's not good for the knife and not good for your fingers. I will actually go ahead and tape over this edge just for a little extra protection and to prevent scratches while I'm working on the handles. So the next thing is to go into the wood shop and make some handles for this. So let's head inside. Down here in the basement wood shop in the house, where I have more woodworking tools available, and we will discuss a little bit about some handle options, and I'll see what I decide to do by the time we actually get ready to put the handles on. So let's take a closer look at what some of the options might be. Well, here is the draw knife that we've made, and it is not sharp. We'll sharpen it after we put the handles on it. And here's one of my older antique draw knives, certainly not one I made. And it has round handles. They're fatter on the end, and that allows for a good grip. And it's fairly typical for, even though your index finger is longer than your little finger, you wrap tighter there, and the back of your hand doesn't tend to wrap as tight, and that gives you something to pull against. So that's fairly typical for draw knife handles. Even this little draw knife has similarly shaped handles, although they're a bit more artistically done perhaps. I'll apologize for the light down here. There isn't as much light as there should be, but it's all I've got, and we're just going to have to go with it. Now, attaching the handles is something we have to think about here. These handles have an iron cap over the base of the handle, has a hole in it, and the tang comes all the way through and has been riveted over. So that's certainly an option for putting handles on. This little draw knife, the tangs were drawn out extremely thin and put all the way through, and they're just bent over and clinched. So they're just driven back into the handle. Makes it a little harder to change the handle if you ever break a handle, but very secure otherwise. I've also used a nut and bolt with a threaded tang to go all the way through a handle in the past, and that can look pretty good, especially if it's something other than just an ordinary hardware store nut, either an acorn nut or a square nut. And I've seen handles put on that are just put into the wood, and they are either barbed or they're just epoxied in, and that's all valid ways of doing it. So what do we want for our handle? Well, here are some options. This is obviously a chisel and not a draw knife, but that's a pleasant handle. That would be comfortable. It perhaps could be a little bigger, although this one is probably too big. That's actually for a different kind of tool. But that gives you a little bit of an idea what handles like that might look like on here. One option for smaller draw knives might actually be a file handle. You can just buy these, put them on there, and just call it done. Completely functional, but perhaps not as good looking, I suppose. So I think what we're going to do is I'm going to make handles very similar to this, and we're going to do that on the wood lathe. These octagonal handles I tend to do on the belt grinder in the blacksmith shop. In most cases, I prefer a handle for a draw knife to have a collar or a ferrule that helps strengthen this joint so the handle can't split. If you're twisting and pulling odd, you could split the handle, and putting the handle in gives you a real chance of splitting it as well. So that helps ensure that's not going to happen. What I use for these frequently are bronze bushings. You can buy these from industrial suppliers in all sorts of different sizes, and they're just pretty much ready-made collars for use on wood turnings like this for whatever you might be making a handle for. Some people use copper water pipe. This is black pipe, just regular old black plumbing pipe, gas pipe. It's been cut off, cleaned up, and then run through the forge and waxed, so it makes for a nice black ferrule. That's the same type that is on this octagonal handle. And I have used EMT tubing or conduit that is a galvanized thin wall tubing, and you can cut it to length, soak it in acid to take all the galvanizing off, and then run it through the forge to blacken it, and that doesn't make a bad ferrule. They're a lot thinner, but they aren't too bad. I think today, for this draw knife, we're probably going to go with these two black pipe ferrules though. Before we start, I want to protect the blade, even though the draw knife gets very little use here. I've just got a piece of cardboard. I'm just going to tape that to the blade, and that helps protect the blade from nicks and chips and whatever else might happen while we're fitting and looking at handles. And then also helps protect you if there are some sharp spots on the blade. Even though we have not intentionally sharpened it, you can probably still find a way to cut yourself on it if you try hard enough. So that'll protect that. So now we have to choose some sort of wood to make our handles out of. I have lots of options over here that I can use for various tool handles, although I'm probably not going to dig to the bottom of the pile to find the more exotic stuff like cocobolo or ebony or any of that kind of stuff. We'll choose something that's pretty close to the top here. And I think you can use just about anything for a draw knife handle like this. It's a low stress handle. You're not hitting it with a mallet. You're not swinging it like you would a hammer handle. You could probably even get away with pine, although eventually that's going to wear and maybe splinter a little bit, so I wouldn't go with really soft woods. But just about any decent hardwood. I've got some Osage orange. I've got a big hunk of maple here. I've got some birch. Those look like the top choices. I got some hickory, but the hickory I try to save for my axe and adze handles, and it's all appropriately sized for that. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go with some of this birch because I've got a fair amount of it, and it's not really great axe or adze handle wood, so it'd probably make really nice draw knife handles. I think the first thing I'll do is square this up a little bit better so it'll turn better. So just like I don't really show welding because I'm not really a super proficient welder, I'm not going to show a lot of wood turning. I'll let you watch over my shoulder, but I'm not going to really try to describe what I'm doing. I guarantee you there are better ways out there, better places to learn wood turning. So I'm just going to go on and I'm going to make the handle, and we're either going to run it at high speed or normal speed depending on how long it takes. And then we'll pick it up again on the other side when the handle is finished. As I said, I'm no wood turner, but I get by. And that's a pretty close fit. It's not an exact fit though, we're going to have to work on that. But first I want to glue this ferrule on and make sure it stays. It pays to protect the handle you just worked so hard on. Pretty easy to wipe the epoxy off the ferrule before it dries, so I'm not too worried about it. And it doesn't take very much epoxy. And then I'll let that sit and dry for a little while. And then I'll finish sanding it, and we'll probably have to go back to the blacksmith shop to show you how I deal with the final fit up. So that's one handle complete. Now I have to make another one just like it, or I hope I can. If not, I may have to make 2 or 3 before I end up with a pair that actually look like they belong on the same tool. So I'm headed back to the lathe. We're going to let the glue dry, and I'll join you later. Well, I got both of the handles finished last night down in the wood shop. They're pretty close. They aren't an exact match, but they're close enough they belong on the same draw knife, I think. So now we have to fit them to the draw knife. I have a 2-step round hole in the handle. I drilled with a larger bit that's the same diameter as where it should come to rest up here, and I drilled with a smaller bit, full depth. But of course, they don't fit. So we have to figure out a way to get a square peg in a round hole. I've said it before, we're blacksmiths, we can do this, and I'm going to show you how. So we're going to start with the draw knife and the vise, and I still need to do a little sanding and oil the back of the handle where it was chucked in the lathe and I cut it off. I never finished that. So that allows me the freedom to put a little pencil mark on here. And that's just a reference that I'm going to line up with the edge of the blade as we fit the handle so that it goes back on the same way every time. Otherwise, we end up with a much bigger hole because the handle isn't going to be perfectly symmetrical. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to heat the tang and we're going to burn the handle into it, and it will burn a hole that's the exact same size as the tang. The vise acts as a heat sink, so we should never get enough heat into the blade that we have any trouble with our temper. That just shouldn't be an issue here. And if you made your knife out of all tool steel instead of the laminate that I used here, heating this up and letting it slow cool essentially normalizes the tang and will take some stress out of the bends, and those are the areas that are the most vulnerable. So this is beneficial for a tool steel knife, just to draw that temper way back in the fragile areas. And this smokes and flames and does all sorts of stuff, but that's pretty much all we got to do, and we're going to have to do that twice. Remember which handle goes on which end. Sometimes it'll take 2 or 3 fittings to get a handle to fit properly. That really went quite easily. Well, you notice I did not drill all the way through my handles. We talked about that being one way to attach the handles. And it is certainly a very old, very traditional way of doing it. But I do kind of like modern adhesives. So we're going to take this back to the wood shop, and we are going to epoxy the handles in. That's all there is to it. It does pay to put your handles back on and make sure they're both set to the same level. This one could go a little bit deeper, so we're going to heat it up again. That's probably better. You don't want to overcook the handles or take a risk of cracking it, which is a possibility if you've got some kind of fragile wood that the gas pressure will actually build up and crack the handle. I haven't had that happen often, but once or twice. So also be careful how you hold it. If you put your hand up here and it cracks, you're liable to jam that hot tang into the palm of your hand. So work with it from the side like this. Much less likely to hurt yourself. That looks better. Now I'm going to let that cool, and then we'll head downstairs. And here, this is still cold enough to touch where the blade is. So that's no risk changing the temperature of the blade at all. But it is hot back here. And at this point, you can actually quench these if you need to. If you're worried about the heat bleeding into the blade, they've already cooled far enough that they've normalized quite well if it's tool steel, but being mild steel, it's not going to hurt it a bit. Actually, I think it's easier to bring the epoxy and the things I need to mix it to the blacksmith shop than it is to move the cameras and the lights back to the wood shop and do it all there and then move everything back up here to finish the video. Hope that makes sense. Anyways, let's go ahead and put the handles on. And why do I prefer epoxy? That's probably a good question to start with. Epoxy works. It's a very good way to put handles on, and it seals the handle up. Getting moisture down inside a wooden handle will destroy the tang over time. And you find old draw knives, the tangs are just rusty and crusty. They won't hold a handle anymore. Either the handle's still on there and it's loose because it was never fixed solidly, it was just riveted over, or it has actually lost the handle because it's so rusty that there's nothing left there to hold a handle on. So I like epoxy because it helps seal it out. It's a solid connection. It keeps me from having to drill all the way through the back side of the handle and clinch or rivet. And while that's not a bad way to go, it can be a very solid connection. There's also a risk that you're going to split the handle when you do that. And I've had that happen on a handful of occasions, and it's really frustrating to put all that work into it. And then when you're trying to peen over this little bit of rivet, you get a little bow down in here somewhere, and the handle cracks. So that's no fun. So I think epoxy is very good. It's certainly a modern approach to the problem. No need to do it. You can use any of those other approaches. You can even cut little barbs on this. And when you fit the handle, these handles are slightly loose after burning them in. If you're not going to glue it on, at this point you'd lock this back in the vise very solidly, take a rubber or rawhide mallet and drive this on to complete the final fit. So you're actually nailing the handle onto the tang essentially. And if you cut little barbs in there, odds of it coming off are very slim. But I'm going to go ahead and go with the epoxy. I think it's a really good, reliable way to do this. And that's just the way we're going to do it today. When we look at our handles and we switch them end per end, notice that this handle doesn't actually fit this tang. So they are definitely custom made, so you have to make sure that they go back on the tangs that they were made to fit, and in the orientation that they were made to go on. So as long as we know that, we're pretty good to go. Now epoxy makes a horrible mess. You'll get epoxy in your fingers, you're going to get sticky gluey fingerprints all over the handles. These already need to be sanded again because of dirty blacksmith fingerprints. But I'm going to wrap them in a little bit of shrink wrap. And then seal that up with a little bit of tape right to the end to do my best to avoid getting epoxy on the handle in the first place. It's the biggest downside to epoxy in my eyes is that it is just really easy to make a mess with it. Some people are cleaner about it than I am, I suppose, but doesn't hurt to be careful. You still see our marks through the shrink wrap. The other place I'm going to seal it up is just seal this whole blade area up, just to be sure. Don't really need the handles on there at this point. This just guarantees that I'm not going to make a mess all over the handle. Now the tangs are easy enough to clean. A paper towel with a little bit of light oil on it really does a pretty good job of cleaning the tangs off. I just want to keep it off the blade. So that's all I need to do there. I'm just using a simple 2-ton epoxy. Nothing very fancy or very special. You can get real into different epoxies. There's a huge number of varieties out there, all with different properties and different reasons you might like them or might not like them. And personally, I say just find a decent brand and a decent product and try it and see if it works for you. This isn't a high stress use. Again, one of the main reasons for doing this is to seal moisture out. I want to make sure I get epoxy all the way down in that hole and make sure I've got it all over the tang. I can kind of feel a little bit of pressure build up there, and it wants to squirt the handle back off, so you kind of know you got epoxy all the way down in there. You may need to fuss with just a little bit because there may be air bubbles that will eventually come out, and you don't want to leave them starved of epoxy. So pay attention to what your working time is. This gets about a 15-minute working time, so before that's up, I will come back and I will check and make sure that things haven't settled too much. That's really all there is to it. And I prefer to stand it up like this so that any epoxy drools back down into the hole and not all over the blade and doesn't drain the joint of all of its epoxy that it needs. But it also needs to have weight on the handles so that the handles can't slide off. So I'm going to find a way to balance that up there. It's amazing what these little spring clamps come in handy for around the shop. So I'm just going to leave that like that while I go on and do other things. This takes about 2 hours for this epoxy to be safe to handle. So we're going to wait a few hours. But I'm also, like I say, I'm going to keep checking back and make sure that if I have an air bubble that works its way out, that I put a little more epoxy back in right at the tang. We're waiting for the time to pass to check this. Make sure you get all the epoxy off the tangs and clean up any big blobs at the top of the handle. Doesn't hurt to have a little bit of a thin layer there. Helps seal the wood up. And to make sure it's all off the handle, just a little light oil on a rag. Don't put enough oil to drip down in there. Epoxy won't stick to the oily surface. But enough to clean the iron tang off. Oop, don't pull it out. And then you don't have to get in there and try and figure out how to get the little epoxy goobers off of there. Well, it's been a few hours, and in theory this epoxy should be set well enough to handle without any problems. One good way to test that is take the little stick you used to mix it and see if it's pretty solidly glued to whatever you mixed it on. So in this case, I'm pretty comfortable that we're set. So I don't need to worry about it standing up anymore. I can take the tape off the handles. So there is our draw knife now with handles, and for most practical purposes it's a completed draw knife. Now I do want to do a little bit more sanding on the handles just to clean them up a little bit, get some of my grubby fingerprints off, put some more oil on it, and I want to go ahead and sharpen it. Now the way you choose to sharpen your draw knife is really up to what equipment you have. You can get very close on the belt grinder. It's real easy to overheat the edge and soften the temper a little bit more than you intend to if you're not careful on a belt grinder. So that may not be the best unless you've got one you can slow down to a real slow speed, and or you're very comfortable doing that. There are other grinders you can use if you want to grind. You can do it all with water stones, oil stones, or diamond stones. Lots of options. I don't think I'm going to go into the sharpening process too much because there is so much personal preference, so much myth and legend in sharpening, and people have very passionate views on how you should sharpen, and no matter how I sharpen this, 80% of you will disagree with the method I chose. And I could sharpen it 5 different ways and some of you would still disagree with the way I did it because it is such a passionate topic these days. What would our forefathers have done? They would have done this on a sandstone grinding wheel, got it until it raised a burr on the back side, and then they would have gone over it with a single whetstone, either water or oil, but a natural stone, and then maybe taken a strop to it. That's probably about it. Nowadays people like to go to 5,000 or 10,000 or 12,000 grit finishes and strop them, and they have all these rituals and practices they go through. Does that make for a better edge? Yeah, probably. It probably works a little bit smoother. It's probably lasts a little bit longer. But you can get a draw knife that you're going to be able to cut with a lot faster than that if you don't get too hung up on all this modern philosophy on sharpening. Me, I am going to take it to the belt sander. I'm going to get it very close. Maybe I'll raise a burr with about a 220 belt. Then I'll finish it off on diamond stones, and I'll take it to an extra fine diamond stone, which is nowhere near as fine as a surgical Arkansas stone or an 8,000 grit water stone, but more than suitable for our purposes. So I'm going to go do that. I'm going to sand the handles. We're going to finish it. I'm going to wrap this video up, and we'll take a look at how the finished draw knife works. But this one video has been 3 days in the making, and it's just time to be done with it. So I'm going to finish it up, and I'll see you in just a few seconds video time back down in the basement workshop where we can try it out on the shaving horse. Well, we have a pretty nice sharp edge on this now. I've gone over it with an extra fine diamond stone. And finally I'll go over a leather strop with a little bit of buffing compound. Now if you're working a draw knife like this, well, I'm not going to give you real specific directions in sharpening and leave that up to your personal preference. Make sure your fingers are not hanging over the edge of the stone or the strop. It's best to work away, so if you do let your finger hang over, you won't cut it. But it's real easy to hold a stone like this, and this is a diamond stone on a plastic plate, with your finger hanging over, and it's very easy to cut yourself. So hold it back or these with the deep rib plate, I can actually hold it by the rib on the inside. And that way my fingers are completely out of the way, and it is much, much safer. How sharp a draw knife needs to be is just up to personal preference of the one using it. I believe historically the blacksmith would have made the draw knife and he would not have sharpened it. It would be up to the carpenter to sharpen his own tools and put the exact bevel angle and the exact type of edge he wants on them. And that's something that for some reason people today expect tools to come to them sharp and don't expect to have to do that initial edge. Hopefully they know how to do it later on, because they're only going to get it sharp once. After that, it's their own problem. Does it work? It would seem to. That is a 100% functional draw knife. Got a little bit of a splitty piece of wood here. It's a little bit of black locust that I've had laying around. And yes, you can work it bevel down, and that allows you to get in and cut some little curves. But the handles are more comfortable in this draw knife bevel up, because I set them just slightly at a down angle towards the flat side of the knife. But that's it. That's a draw knife. That's what we set out to make. It's been 5 days in the making, not all day by any means. It's an hour here and an hour there. Forged it the first day, refined it by filing or grinding the second day, and then heat treated it that day. On the third day, I polished it, cleaned it up. Fourth day, I made handles. Fifth day, I fit the handles. You can probably do a lot of these steps more than a single day. I just had to split it up so I could get other things done at the same time. All in all, it's probably only about 4 or 5 hours of actual serious work for me with a grinder. If you're using files to do all of the blade refinement and shaping and polishing and hand sanding, it might be closer to 10 hours by the time you got this all done. Plan on it being a big project if you're going to hand sand it. But if you got a belt grinder, 4 or 5 hours is probably a realistic number. Now, video time, we've probably spent about 20 to 30 hours videoing and editing and things like that throughout the process and the 3 videos that we've done. But in the end, we get a good usable tool, one we can be proud of. And I like the little bit narrower blade for working on axe handles and adze handles, because sometimes my bigger draw knives are just a little bit too big. So this one I'm going to keep. It's not for sale. Now, handles. We talked about making handles match, and that sometimes you might have to make more than one set of handles to get 2 that match. I'm currently working on 4 other draw knives, so I'm going to make 10 more handles. Out of 10 handles that I go out of my way to try to make the same, even though I'm not the best wood turner, I should be able to find 4 pairs of handles that are close enough to belong on the same knife. And the more of them you do, the better you get. So that's a good way to work on handles, is make a bunch of them and then match them up until they all go together. No big deal. Yep, anyways, I'm just making wood shavings, and it's easy to sit at a shaving horse and just make wood shavings with no point, because this is really kind of fun. The shaving horse, by the way, is made by Mark Hicks at Plate 11 Workshops. I don't know if he still offers this. He was doing a small run of them several years ago, and I managed to get in contact with him at just the right time and was able to order one. But I would contact Mark at Plate 11 if you're interested in this. If not, there are plans on the internet for lots of similar shaving horses. It is the thing that makes a draw knife easier to use. It's a foot operated vise, and you can move the board around, clamp it however you need to. This one is height adjustable, very nice, very well thought out tool, and beautifully made. He does excellent work. The one I made looked like a log with 4 legs on it, and I don't have it anymore because this one is so much better. Anyways, I hope you found this video interesting. I hope you found the whole series of 3 videos interesting. I'll try to put links throughout this one to the other 2 just in case you didn't watch it, but you can just go back to my main video page on the channel And you should be able to find these. They've all been done in the last week or so, so they're pretty closely grouped together. If you like the video, by all means give it a thumbs up. I'd love it if you hit that subscribe button, subscribe to the channel. But whether you're ready to tackle an edge tool project like a draw knife, or just making blacksmithing tools, tools are a good way to hone and refine your skills. But in any case, do get out to the shop, make something, make anything. Spend some time working, challenge your abilities, challenge your imagination. But do stay safe, do wear your safety glasses, and we'll see you for the next one.